Ready, steady, go. Let's start with the first presentation that is from Anastasia Ostrovsky, Haven Park and City Brazil from MIT Media Lab, design research in HRI, roboticist, design features, and users as co-designers. So Anastasia, if you want to take the floor, please go ahead. We are looking forward to hearing your work.
Yes, thank you, Christina. Can everyone hear me okay?
Perfect.
Wonderful. All right, so as Christina said, I'm presenting our work today around sort of what we see as a 3 touch point perspective of how we can be approaching design research in HCI, looking at roboticists, looking at the design features of these technologies, and then also looking at users as co-designers. So when we say looking at roboticists as a corner of this approach, we're really advocating for understanding design by how it's actually being done and who is developing these technologies. There's been a lot of work on this in HCI, but there's been much less done in the HRI area. And at our work, we've been interviewing researchers to better understand how do they view the social impact of their technologies and what tools are really necessary for them to be able to successfully deploy these technologies as well as understand them within the social context. And we're really advocating that we need to be understanding this corner in order to move forward with understanding design in HRI. The second corner we're looking at is the design features of the device. We all know that with these embodied technologies, you have social presence, you have more persuasive features that can really impact our interactions with these devices. And we really advocate that in order for us to be sure we're designing ethically responsible technologies, we need to understand what are the boundaries of these socially pervasive technologies and how can we design technologies to respect the autonomy of people. And then on our last category, we really go into users as co-designers. And what we mean by that is in our design processes, we aim to make sure we are empowering our users to be a part of the design process, whether that's older adults or working with teenagers. By incorporating our users more into these processes, we can make better informed devices and also even seek to understand what are the implications of these devices for people. And in each of these areas, we've been doing work in this space because we believe it's really crucial to move forward and really understand HRI design through these lenses to make more socially responsible technologies, to improve design features, and really make design an integral part of HRI. And we pose 3 different questions at the end of our paper where we're really seeking to understand how is design defined by researchers in HRI? What methods are involved in a research by design approach for HRI? How can we democratize design in HRI for both the designers and our users as co-designers? And how can we better support and train researchers to develop technologies through design research, mixed method, and interdisciplinary approaches, which in turn we think will be supporting these researchers and understanding the social impact of these technologies. And with that, I'm open to any questions. Thank you for having us here today.
Perfect, Anastasia, fascinating. So I would like to leave 2 minutes very quickly for 2 questions from the audience. If they're there, I will feel free to just take the stage if you are ready to ask a question or
if there is no question or people need to warm up a bit, I have a small question.
Yeah, so, okay, that's good.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Of course, the paper, it's nice, so please people have a look at it. So my little question is about users. So did you find substantial differences or something that let you think, okay, doing co-design with users in HRIs is really different for this aspect, or there are some specific challenges in that because we are dealing with robots?
Yes, so we actually are just finishing doing a year-long co-design with older adults, and we structured it so that we would be able to help them gain knowledge as we went through the process. So there were 7 stages, and one of those specifically that we felt was very key for our project was we had people live with a robot for a month period. And so that gave them a familiarity with the technology and could really help them ground their experience and their knowledge and say, I want this features, I don't want this. But then it helped us also as well move into more involved co-design activities, such as actually programming the robot, or to even going forward and creating the next design development of the robot with us as a team of researchers. And so for co-design with HRI, one of the difficulties is really making sure that older adults have this grounding with the technology. And we found that living with it is one of the best experiences for that.
Thanks, very interesting. Living with the robot as a part of the study, it's indeed really interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, so looking at the time, I'm actually going to move forward just to make sure that everybody has time to discuss. But I have more questions for you, Anastasia. Maybe offline we're going to have a bit of a chat. And now let's move to the second position paper. This is by Suhaib Aslam, Edwin Dertin, and Jelle van Dijk from the University of Twente, designerly scaffolding for co-designing social robots and human-robot interaction. So please, Suhaib, I guess you're going to be introducing your work.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. I hope everybody can hear me as well. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so indeed, the theme we focus on is about inclusion of disadvantaged users in the design of social robots. And the user group we mostly focused on was adults with autism. We figured that for this target group, social robots are often put to use, but we couldn't find a comprehensive co-design, participatory design methodology to really involve them in the process for designing said robots. So basically, we tried to take some first steps towards designing such a methodology. We focused on scaffoldings. So we tried to embed scaffoldings in a narrative-driven card-based process with which a facilitator could work with a participant from the target group to sort of come up with a blueprint that would encompass both, the problem space within their household that they want to focus on and the social robot concept they're interested in. And then we combined this with physical plug-and-play building blocks that you could rapidly prototype your blueprints with. And our aim with this scaffolded process was twofold. One was to really enable a meaningful collaboration between robot designers and members of this target group. So really, with the scaffoldings, our aim was to enable the target group to overcome any constraints they might have regarding, for example, thinking abstractly regarding easily communicating with such a facilitator, and yeah, etc. And the second aim was to, by going between, an abstract blueprint or through on these cards on a table, and by trying to rapidly prototype it by going back and forth between a real world prototype and a blueprint, we often forced participants and ourselves to sort of come up with concepts that are not just these generic social robots that can do anything and everything, but that are really based on needs, because these concepts would have to be grounded in the real world. And so that would lead to really need-based concepts, to the extent that in some cases it would empower certain participants to say, hey, why am I even looking for technology for this? I think I don't need any external help for this, and so on. So with that, our question is, how might we best design scaffoldings to include disadvantaged users in the co-design of social robots, or in the design of robots in general?
Great, a relevant question indeed. So we can go to the audience and see whether there's a question. Otherwise, I do have a question, but I first want to hear from our participants. Yes, we have a question from Helena in the chat. What do you think the most valuable outcome of such scaffolding sessions could be? Yeah,
so I think the most valuable, in my eyes, valuable would mean things that would stick on, that would live on after the project, so some stewardship. So, we do these sessions and we leave. For me, valuable would mean what would live on. And I think in our case, those were, by going through such a session with participants, of course, the aim of a robot designer is to learn more about how to best design those robots. But we found that we did this in an autism care facility here in the Netherlands, and we found that there were certain tidbits of this process that lived on after the project. So for example, just from the top of my head, one of the things we realized was that a lot of times participants would come up with concepts which would sort of reinforce any constraints that they might already have. So one of the things that that came out was the facilitator was like, hey, I think in the future, outside of this process as well, I want to try to push participants a bit beyond their comfort zone, so as to not reinforce what constraints they might already have, but to sort of push them a bit. So I think the most valuable things were insights regarding, the role of technology in their lives, but also just these more process-based insights that lived on.
Perfect. And feel free also to answer the presenter questions or to continue the discussion in the chat if you like. I will just move forward to allow the other presenters to introduce their work. Thank you so much, Suhaib and Helena, for the question. All right, so now we are at the third paper. It's also coming from the MIT Media Lab, and it is a paper from Kike Arias, Soyoung Jung, Haven Park, and Cindy Brazil, and is titled Toward Designing User-Centered Idle Behaviors for Social Robots in the Home. So I guess Kika is going to present, so please take the floor.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Christina, very much. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, perfect. So just to start, the motivation for this paper, obviously it's sort of about idle behavior. It's perhaps a little bit more application-based than I guess a lot of the papers that we have in this workshop. But the motivation for this paper was driven by a study that my colleagues and I ran in the fall of last year, in which we allowed MIT undergraduate students to live with a social robot for a 1-week period. And in that 1 week, they were tasked with engaging in a specific intervention with the robot. But for most of the time, the robot was actually idle in their room. So, they were passively doing homework or just living their life, and the robot was kind of just there. And they were allowed to interact with it, obviously. And at the end of this study, we received a lot of positive feedback, users really liking living with the robot, kind of having an extra roommate or something kind of analogous to a pet. But we also received a lot of feedback about users being really uncomfortable and sometimes they said kind of disturbed by the robot's idle behaviors. And as researchers and as people who kind of work with this robot, we found that really surprising. However, looking at related work shows that that phenomenon is not unique to our robot or even our study. In a lot of studies where there's sort of like this home element to the robot, where the robot's being brought in a very personal space, we see users being uncomfortable, some users putting boxes over the robots to sort of obstruct cameras or microphones because they just really don't want to be watched, or avoiding the robot entirely so that they don't have to interact with it. And a lot of this sort of fear stems from idle behavior. Idle behavior is something that's kind of tacked on to commercial social robot design. A lot of research that's done about it is done in a very short-term context. In research studies, people aren't really interacting with robots for more than 5 to 10 minutes at a time. However, when we sort of see social robots in long-term private settings, that's where some of the flaws of idle behavior start to come out. So in this paper, we suggested kind of 3 main areas for improvement, those domains being in privacy, comfort, and control. And we sort of proposed design guidelines for making improvements in each of these categories. And while I could definitely go into specifics about what each of those actual design implementations look like, he's sort of driven by these 2 main kind of theories. One, looking at prior technology. So, technologies that like your laptop, your laptop and your iPhones, and sort of seeing how technology that's actually integrated in the lives of participants, how they make use of certain features. You have privacy settings, you have lights on your laptop to tell you when things are recording. And the other sort of theory was just giving the agency for the user to customize the robot as much as they need, and so that they are able to feel comfortable. because ultimately the user base that we want social robots to be used for is really diverse. So it's kind of impossible for designers to create a one-size-fits-all experience and expect everyone to really love it. So taking all of this into consideration, my final thought is that we ultimately talk a lot about gathering feedback and co-designing with users, which is obviously incredibly important. But I'm personally curious as to how we can ultimately create a methodology to sort of utilize that feedback in a very concrete way and design an experience that caters to as many people as possible. And so with that being said, I'm happy to take any and all questions.
Great, Kika. There's already a question in the chat from Andrea Bonarini and another one from Marianne. I'm gonna read it out loud so it's easy for everybody to follow. Andrea asks, what was the aim of the robot? Why people should have liked to have it at home?
Yeah, so for our specific study, the robot was serving a purpose, like they were engaging with sort of these psychological interventions, positive psychology interventions, and that's actually a paper that was submitted to this conference. It is one of the best, is recommended as like one of the best papers. So you're more than happy to take a look at that. But sort of a lot of these robots are put in the home for a specific purpose. However, you know, users are not 24/7 engaged in that intervention. There's also idle behavior that takes place that a lot of users, when they're seeking out the specific intervention, you know, they want to improve their health outcomes, they want to improve this and that. They don't realize that the idle behavior is part of that experience until they have the robot in their home and they're like, oh, I don't like that when I wake up in the morning, it's already staring at me, or maybe when I get up to go to the bathroom, it like turns and looks at me, and that's really awkward. So, yeah.
There's another one in the chat, and maybe if you can give a brief answer, so then we move on. Marianne, she's very interested in your topic, and she's asking, what are your recommendations for robot appearance? Considering, so, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. So the sort of recommendation that we made in the paper is kind of drawing from actually laptops, and you know, obviously on your laptop, you're staring at it right now, there's like a big green light that pops up when the camera is in use. And so sort of having these visual indicators as like one that you mentioned, right now, some robots, they don't even have indicators of when they're recording or when they're, you know, recording video or audio. So having those indicators, or even just for robots that have physical communication capabilities of language, being able to just ask them like, hey robot, are you recording right now? And, you know, they can say yes or no. But obviously like a hardware system is a little bit more reliable and provides greater safety for the user.
Great, thank you so much for the answers, and to Andrea and Marianne. There's also another question from Heike Luden in the chat. So maybe Kika, you want to pick it up in the chat, and I will move on to the next presentation. Now we are circling back to methodology after a bit more of an applied point of view. And the next position paper is from Luisa Fernandez, Alexander Bernardino from the Instituto Superior Técnico in Lisbon. And the title of the position paper is New Social Robots Design Methodology to Promote Empathy in Human-Robot Interactions. So I guess Luisa is going to present, and I'm going to leave the floor to her. Or maybe she's not here. Let me see. Is a co-author of Luisa here, perhaps? I don't see nobody. So maybe they lost connection. So I will suggest to move on and see whether they are connecting back. You can still look at the paper online. We're going to have the link in the chat. So now it's the time for going towards another applied point of view related to e-mental health care. So the next position paper is presented by Benedetta Lusi, Charlotte von Lothringen, Randy Klaase, Heike Lude, and Matthias Nordzai from the University of Twente. And the title of the paper is Design for Compassion, Designing Robots for E-Mental Health Care. So Benedetta, I guess you can take.
Yeah, hi everyone. I hope you can hear me. So as Cristina said, I'm from the University of Twente, and this project is related to a bigger project that is in the context of e-mental health care. So it's pretty specific context, as I heard also other people are working in. The reason why it was born is because the need for mental health care is rising, and so are the costs. So technology is, of course, called to support that and to be a solution for that. For example, ICT has been put forward as a solution, but the transition towards a more sustainable mental health care is not, has not taken place to the extent that we envisioned or that was envisioned, because there are some barriers that prevent this transition from happening. So for example, clients show low adherence, and professionals are not confident enough with the technology in order to just explain it to the client or to put the therapy onto a more technology mediated level. So what we propose is to use the methodology of designing for values to sort of design new technology that is based on compassion. And compassion as a specific value that is very meaningful in also therapy. So in a psychology, in the psychology context. And why compassion is important to say, it's because it entails it includes a part of active steps. So for example, you know how, of course, technology can sense, and so it can take in data, but also the motivation to act is something that is pretty new. And this is the main point, because with this, we go into why we're talking about HRI and why we're focusing on how can, for example, a robot can be compassionate, right? It's a new concept, it's a new thing to think about. And what we did in this paper is we tried to make an hypothesis of what it would be like to design a compassionate process from the point of view of a machine. So for example, we took the definition of compassion as a process that is made of 5 steps. And we tried to translate it into the point of view of the machine. So from human to human to machine to human, and human to machine. This is, of course, because if we translate the process of therapy from, you know, a therapist and a client to a client and a machine, that can be either, you know, in this case, we're asking ourselves also which technology could be best. So that's one of the questions that we have at the end, because we're, of course, exploring not only how to design a compassionate technology and a compassionate robot, but also how can we do that in the best way? What technology should we use? Why, for example, should we use AI, and how should we use AI? Those are very interesting questions for us. There's a lot of things that we need to explore still, but this is the main topic.
All right, thank you, Benedetta, for the introduction to your topic. We have a question from Luke, I think. How do you compare designing a robot to feel compassionate towards people and designing a robot or app to help people to be compassionate to each other? It's a great question.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, of course, that's the point. That's the point that needs to be explored, first of all, but mainly the thing that I would say is, so in the case of the robot, we tend to think, okay, should it be, how much should you resemble a person and how much should you resemble a machine, you know? So in the case of an app, we don't really ask ourselves that, or we go towards e-bots, or we go towards the direct translation of what a person would do. So in the case of how should we design a machine, we think, okay, maybe, you know, we don't want to make it look like a human. We don't want to act like a human. We want to do something else. And so if we want to do something else, how do we do that? I mean, for me, that's the main answer to this question, but of course, I guess there are a lot more.
All right, so maybe there's more to discuss during the breakout sessions about this, because I see that there's space to expand. All right, there's, I think for now we can move forward then, given that we have a bit more of time because the previous presenter was not here, we can maybe have a little room for more questions, because I see that there's interest and that's nice to have these kind of engaging conversations. All right, so last but not least, for this first batch of presentations, now is the time of Gerrit Vroom, Zoltan Ruzak, and Gert Kortem, I guess. I'm sorry for the mispronunciation. The title is Context Confrontation, Elicitation and Exploration of Conflicts for Delivery Robots on Sidewalks. So Gerrit, please take the floor.
Thank you, Christina. So let me take a breath first so that we can land a bit. When I look at human interaction, I always feel it's a bit like a dance. There's this whole complex back and forth. And that means that lots of unexpected patterns can and will emerge. And I think we already had an amazing example of the idle behaviors not doing what they should. And when we look at my own area, which is delivery robots, we run into similar problems, like delivery robots getting stuck on curbs and having run-ins with people thinking they can pass right in front of the robot while they actually perhaps shouldn't or should. And I think what all of us are doing is trying to predict what problems and conflicts will emerge and trying to solve them. And when we look specifically in delivery robots, lots of people try to do this really technically, and there's lots of technical solutions where people use papers on social distance, not social distancing, but just proxemics, and try to implement that. And we have been taking a small step back and asked the question, so how can we actually elicit representative insight into the conflicts that will arise? And like I said, psychological theories are a good start for that, but they are often too far away from the instance. So they might tell us about distance you keep to people if you're a person, but be less applicable to a robot. And what we wanted to do instead, or did, is explore this in the wild. Not to improvise solutions, so not to look at the solution space, but rather we try to explore in the wild the problem space. And for that, we did something, well, that I think was fun, but I hope also is relevant. So we ignored all humans. We had our delivery robot drive around in a human-rich environment, the sidewalk, and ignored any single human and treated them as if they didn't exist. And we use that as a way to elicit conflicts and see what actually went wrong and what we should actually be solving. So basically to get a rich idea in the actual problem space. 3 minutes is way too short to tell you about the results. There's more in the paper, but just some quick teasers. One thing we saw is that, for example, people are very kind. So if you ignore them, they just go out of the way. And in fact, they might actually be more willing to help the robot and push it along if it gets stuck. And at the same time, we also saw, for example, that people, when they are static, so if they are not moving, that's the precise point where they actually do expect the robot to be adapting to them. So rather than what current work is looking into is like while moving and how to keep the distance, we saw not that important, but actually it was more important to see if people were moving, and stationary people should be actively avoided because they don't expect to solve the problem for the robots. And I think that's well, for us, this was an interesting twist, and I think it fits nicely in here because it's sort of in between the two. That's a very brief overview. Thank you. And thank you for having me here.
Great, Yara. Thank you so much for your introduction. Marianne has a question, or like a very composite question for you. She's inspired by your method, and she says, you mentioned people willingness to help the robot. Did they also react negatively sometimes? And what was the effect of helplessness of the robot?
Thank you. Very interesting question. And yeah, I think something most of us have seen is that people like to test and tease robots. And we saw the same. So people were very much inclined to see what they could get the robot to do and to, well, treat it like a toy to explore. And at the same time, interestingly, we also saw that since we completely ignored humans until the point that we really had to stop to prevent collisions, often that lack of response could also stop those attempts to tease the robot. So at one point we saw people actually like deliberately enter a collision course with the robot and sort of see, okay, well, and then they budged themselves and went out of the way to, so yes, we definitely saw interesting negative reactions. Some were more problematic than others. I think that's
great. Perfect. So what I want to do now, given that we have like at least 5 minutes window for more questions and discussion, I would like to welcome the people that came in a bit later, and just to give you a grasp of where we are at. We are now presenting the position papers that were submitted to the workshop, and we have presented the first batch and we are asking each other questions. So we are there, and in a bit we're gonna have a break. So for whoever wants to grab a cup of coffee or take a breath. And if there's more questions, please do ask. We have a bit more of time before our break. And in general, I found all the presentations really relevant. And of course, it's really nice to see this combination between applied and methodological contributions, which I think they both strengthen our idea to understand the intermediate level knowledge. So, all right. So if I have actually many questions.
Sorry.
No worries. I actually have many questions, and
okay, go ahead.
I have a question for Kika actually, and then I will also ask for Jared. Kika, when I read your paper, I had this kind of extreme reaction that there was, what if we would, get rid of the idle behavior altogether? Because it sounds like it's not really working well for users. And then I touched upon my own experience that I share with one of the participants here, which is Ray from Cornell University, because for example, I've been in front of a robot from MIT Media Lab that is I don't remember the name anymore, for a long time, and it was idle all the time, and it was really annoying for me. So I was wondering, have you thought about getting rid of the idle behavior altogether?
Yeah, so I know that's definitely something that you guys asked me to touch on in the paper, and kind of in thinking about it. So obviously the paper documents kind of the negative side, because that seems to be the voice that within designers or people who have made the robot is kind of less heard. But there are users who actually really enjoy that idle behavior, or at least like some small amount of it. And I think that it does enrich the interaction for those who do enjoy it. However, like there are times when it's not as appropriate, like, and it kind of also just depends on the setting. Obviously these users who we were studying with, the robot was in their personal room, for which in a dorm room, it's, where you change, where you kind of sleep, where you eat, you do everything in that kind of one room. And so that's sort of why in that setting, it's a little bit more invasive. But, in your kitchen while you're cooking, if you're kind of lonely, or, for people who have pets, it's, more something that they're used to, some entity sort of kind of acting on its own. And so that's why in the paper I suggested this idea of like being able to customize the amount of idle behavior, or sort of like the range in which people are able to sort of experience that idle behavior, because you know, you have some people who might not want it entirely, and that's should be acknowledged and that should be accommodated for. You know, you shouldn't have to sacrifice, but at the same time, you have people who maybe they want the robot on all the time or just half of the time, and there's a very wide range of desires there, and it's, like I said, very impossible to accommodate all of them with just one design where you say the robot is off for this period of time and on for this period of time. So, well, I think like, yeah, there are definitely some users who would prefer to not have it at all, and that should be okay, and that should be something that we design for. You know, I think it's also okay to say that it does benefit some users, and there's research saying that like idle behavior does benefit sort of the relationship that users build with these robots, and that's kind of why it was there in the first place. So,
Thank you, Kika, for